Section 24 of Dr. Deane's Way and Other Stories by Faye Huntington and Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Choker and Old Stuffy, Chapter 2. Old Stuffy was smoking villainously, and the den was in its usual state of supreme disorder, when Dick Graves burst in upon his chum the next morning, a huge wooden packing-box hoisted on his shoulder. "Such a place, Tom, as your eyes have not beheld in a month of Sundays! And such a supper as they gave us last night! And, oh jolly, such a breakfast this morning! Buckwheat cakes, and maple syrup, and butter that smelled of June and strawberries. Beefsteak done elegantly, no taste of smoke to that, old fellow. And the coffee, oh, the coffee!" he said, striking an attitude and waxing eloquent, going off into a rhapsody composed of all the six-syllabled superlatives that his versatile memory furnished. "I can live off the memory of that swell for a week," he added, with a sudden descent in ordinary tones. "That's lucky," his companion remarked, succinctly, opening his lips for the first time since the open door had admitted a rush of cold air on his half-frozen feet, and the voluble Dick at the same time. "Why?" "Because the chances are that you will have precious little else to live on." "Don't you go to believing any such abominable croaking as that. What do you suppose is in that box that I nearly broke my back bringing in?" "I don't know," said Tom meditatively, glancing up from his book of medical statistics. "A skeleton, perhaps." "I should not wonder," chuckled Dick. "Two of 'em, maybe. The box was heavy enough for it, only I doubt if their bones are as plainly distinguishable as they will be by the time we are through with them. Now, Tom, just lay aside that book and give attention to business, and we'll unpack the thing. A little lunch, Miss Sarah called it. She evidently surmised that we fellows only lunched once a week or so, on a cold cracker or two. You see, it was sent to you, old fellow. The way of it was, when I was taking a sip of that glorious coffee this morning, and preparing a wonderful buckwheat, I suddenly remembered you, sitting probably on the ash-strewn hearth of Old Stuffy, with your head inside of her, and your cheeks puffed into a pair of bellows, trying to get up a blaze; and with something between a sigh and a groan, I said, 'Tom's at home, he is,' or something to that effect. And so of course they inquired about Tom, and Harlow told them he was the star scholar of our class. What do you think of that, my friend? And so Miss Sarah was very particular to say the lunch was for Mr. Benton and myself." "Who is Miss Sarah?" inquired Mr. Benton, tugging vigorously at the box cover, and taking all the past information very composedly. "She is a sister who makes the most amazing coffee and cake and muffins that a half-starved party ever swallowed. I say, Tom, what do you think of the skeletons? Won't you go into the study of anatomy with new zest?" There they cuddled amid snowy napkins, two of the plumpest, brownest chickens that had met Mr. Thomas Benton's gaze in many a long day. All around them lay little puffy biscuits, and piled high above them, those delights of gentlemen's hearts, doughnuts and crullers, while one entire end of the box was devoted to tier on tier of mince pies, great fat, crispy-looking pies, with raisins popping up from every tiny opening. A slip of paper was pinned on the napkin covering them, and on it was written in delicate chirography, which Dick at once decided could be no one but Miss Sarah's. "If you keep these where they will freeze, and only warm as you wish to use them, they will keep a long time." "We can obey that order to perfection," chuckled Dick. "If she had said where they wouldn't freeze, we would have had to put them in Old Stuffy, and build a fire around them, and then I wouldn't insure them, if the wind were contrary. I say, Tom, isn't this jolly?" "It is very kind and thoughtful," said older and graver Mr. Thomas Benton, with a suspicious mist before his eyes. Some way that box and its carefully packed contents made him think of his mother, and the things she would have done for her boy if she could. Nay, of the things that she had done, of the shirts that he wore, sacred by so many darns taken late in the night by that dear mother. "Kind? I should think it was," Dick said, talking faster than usual to overcome a strange lump in his throat. "They piled the kindness on a fellow, I can tell you. Why, Tom, there were as many as 4 blankets on the bed last night, and hot and cold water in the bathroom. My, it made one feel as if he were somebody. And so delicately they did everything, too. She knew how gentlemen managed when they were hard pressed with their studies, the fine old lady mother said. Didn't take time to eat or sleep, and a nice little lunch came in handy now and then. Thinks I to myself, I guess it will. Tom, don't you think they packed Harlow a box more than half as large as this? What the mischief he will do with it is more than I know. He boards at the Archer Street house, you know, where they have everything that's going. Perhaps, though, they filled it with sawdust or something. I knew what they gave him a box for, of course. So I wouldn't feel awkward about taking mine, and I liked the thoughtfulness. Exactly as well as if I hadn't seen through it. Bless their kind old hearts." Then Dick Graves gave himself to the work of helping Tom bestow their treasure in the old chest, which they wheeled into the further corner by the window, Dick remarking as he did so, "They'll freeze here tight as a brick, no mistake." "How came Harlow to invite you home with him?" Tom said, skillfully moving the legs of the plumpest chicken to make room for a pie. "Ahem," said Dick. That was the one little thing that he had felt like leaving out of his story, that about the cup of cold water and the kneeling together by Harlow's bedside. Not that he was ashamed of it. He had admired and respected Harlow the more ever since. But he had a feeling that Tom wouldn't understand it, or sympathize with it, or at least that he didn't know how to tell it. So, after thoughtfully clearing his throat, he said aloud, "Why, I stood out there, feeling dismal, you know, and he passed by and saw me, and well, I suppose he thought he would." "No doubt," said Tom, and then both betook themselves to their books, Dick saying with a little sigh, "But that coffee, Tom, went ahead of everything. If I could just have pocketed a cup of that for you." "I will take the will for the deed," said Tom kindly, "and be glad that you had it yourself in the bargain. Now, Dick, we mustn't speak again for an hour." It was the next evening but one that Dick Graves sat alone in his room. Choker was blinking vilely on the 3-legged table, and doing justice to her name. Dick sat with his boot heels on Old Stuffy's head, vainly endeavoring to coax a little warmth into his limbs. The night was intensely cold. It was Tom Benton's evening to wrap himself in the old shawl and sally forth in search of letters from home. In extreme weather these two gentlemen rarely appeared on the street together, because the red and green comfortable wasn't considered presentable to the outer world, and there was but one shawl. There came a tap at the door. "Come on," growled the inmate, expecting to see some other shivering occupant of their end of the hall come to beg the loan of a match or a book. The door opened gently, and the handsome face and well-dressed form of Harlow presented itself. Dick brought his feet to the floor with an energy which made Old Stuffy's door fly open, and smoke and ashes come out. Harlow had never seen the inside of the den before. "I am afraid I have disturbed your studies," said this prince of gentlemen, courteously oblivious to smoke and kerosene and discomfort generally. "But I hope they will admit of further disturbance this evening. I dropped in to see if you wouldn't come around to our class prayer meeting. We hold them only an hour, and I think the change rests my brain and fits me better for study." Dick's brain straightway became very busy. This to him was a novel invitation. Class prayer meetings, or indeed prayer meetings of any sort, he never attended. But for that cup of water administered so recently, the glimpse into this young man's home paradise, the hearty welcome there, the thoughtful attentions showered upon him, he would have been able to give a good-humored, prompt refusal. But some way, the memory of all these things pressed in, and made the meditated refusal seem churlish. "I might go, it won't hurt me," he said to himself, thinking rapidly. "It's a little enough thing to do after his kindness." Then there arose another consideration, the shawl. Tom would not be back for half an hour yet, and the evening was very sharp. Aside from the feelings, it certainly would look badly for him to be out without other covering than his ordinary house coat. At this point his eyes rested on the comfortable. "I might wear that," he said, still talking to himself. Harlow had stepped to the table and taken up a book. And then a vision came over this absurd young man, of the absurd figure he would make traveling through the streets beside Harlow in his elegant broadcloth wraps, gotten up in the latest style, himself done up in the red and green comfortable, with the yellow cotton oozing out at numberless holes. And the vision was so very absurd that he seated himself down on the side of the bed and yielded to an uproarious peal of laughter. Harlow looked up inquiringly. "I beg your pardon, Harlow," laughed Dick, still holding his sides. "Something so extremely funny came over me just then that I was obliged to laugh or choke, but it had nothing to do with your invitation, I assure you." "All right," said Harlow, in courteous good humor. "But you are going to accept my invitation, I hope?" Tom sprang up briskly. "Yes," he said, hunting among the pile of papers in the corner for his hat. "I'll go," adding, sotto voce, "I won't freeze, I guess, and even if I do, he's worth accommodating." Just here my storyteller paused, and in place of the fun that had hitherto danced in his eyes, there came a tender, moved expression, and his thoughts seemed to go far away. You must know, dear friends, that I have been repeating to you a story that was told me one stormy night by our family physician, Dr. Graves. I have given you the story in my own words, because there were certain details connected with our noble doctor's heroic battle with the world that I knew he would leave out, and that I meant to tell you of, but somehow they haven't got in. It was a midnight story, and its starting point was the doctor's complimenting me on the cup of coffee that I passed him. It was an unusual thing to hear Dr. Graves tell a story. There was much silver in his hair, and professional cares sat heavily on him. He rarely had time for other than the briefest of professional conversations, but this day had been to us one of special anxiety and fear. Sickness, sharp and severe, had been in our midst. The doctor had been with us during most of the day, and had been unremitting in his care. Towards evening the burden had lifted, but it was not until midnight that the doctor left his patient, and came down with cheery face to drink his cup of coffee, that had waited long. It was the reaction from the day's anxiety, I think, that disposed him to tell, and me to listen to the funny story. Doubly funny when I looked at the dignified face opposite me. I thought of the respectful deference with which people were wont to listen to his opinions, and then imagined him enveloped in that red and green comfortable, or frying eggs on his one cracked plate. I waited a little for the rest of the story, and finding him still silent, ventured at last to question. "What about the prayer meeting, doctor?" "The prayer meeting?" he said, rousing himself with a slight start. "Oh yes, that was a precious meeting to me. It was on that very evening that the precious Saviour, who has been my guide and helper, and never failing support during a distracting life, sought after and found me. I can never forget that evening, nor Harlow's prayer for me, though I thought then, and do now, that perhaps he might have prayed for me until this time, and I had given no heed, if he had not paved the way with his cups of water. In fact, but for his previous kindness to me, I should not have thought of such a thing as going with him to prayer meeting. "And what about Tom?" I asked after a little. "Tom came too," he said with glistening eyes. "He was my dear friend, and after I had discovered what wonderful blessings were to be had in this world, just for the asking, I could not rest until I had coaxed him in. Harlow tried for him too, and it wasn't long before our dreadful little den seemed to us to have been transformed into a very Bethel." "Are these two gentlemen living now?" "Oh, yes, Tom is. Why, he is Dr. Benton of Philadelphia. You surely had heard of him?" Yes, I had. Most people in our vicinity had. He was not only known as a very successful physician, but as a Christian philanthropist. Still, it had not occurred to me that he could be Tom. "And Harlow," continued the doctor, "you are doubtless familiar with his name also. He went as missionary surgeon to southern India. A good man he is, and a grand work he has done there. He is coming home for vacation in the summer. Then we hope to have a reunion, Tom and he and I." "Did you ever go to his home again?" "Often," he said, with a happy look deepening on his face. "Tom was included in the next invitation, and a jolly time we had. He didn't go as often as I, however. He was older, and more sedate than I, and he could not forget his frayed shirts and wristbands. But, bless you, they didn't mind those things, the family didn't. They used to treat us as if we were princes in disguise." After waiting and studying his face a bit, I ventured on another question or suggestion. "Doctor, I want to hear some more about Miss Sarah." The doctor glanced up at me quickly and gave a bright little laugh. "You must ask Mrs. Graves about her," he said briskly. "They are very intimate friends. Indeed, I may say they are inseparable. It all came about, though, from that first cup of wonderful coffee, and really, yours to-night has been almost as good." After that he went back upstairs to his patient. Several months after this, we received one day an invitation that filled me with delight. It was a cordial little note from our doctor's wife, inviting us to take tea informally with two very old friends, Dr. Henry Harlow, then on a visit to this country from his home in India, and Dr. Thomas Benton of Philadelphia fame. The note was signed, "Sarah Harlow Graves." I never realized how much of a simpleton I was, until I stood confronting those two gentlemen, and found that I had actually been expecting to see in Harlow a handsomely dressed young medical student, and that Tom's shirt front would be sadly frayed. Gray-haired, both of them. Dr. Harlow with a stoop to his shoulders, earnest, hard-working looking man, yet neither of them so old nor so professional looking as our own Dr. Graves, the merry Dick of the story. None of them, however, were overmuch troubled with dignity on this particular evening. They all talked at once, they laughed uproariously, they made constant allusions to Old Stuffy, Choker, and the Den. Dr. Harlow seeming to be as thoroughly posted as though his early days had been days of poverty and sacrifice. When we were summoned to tea, our own doctor walked out beside me. "We are going to have such a funny supper to-night," he said to me, with a comic air, "that we thought we must send for you to help us appreciate it." Among other things, they had toast and eggs. Very merry laughter greeted this dish. "Did the plate break, Dick?" queried the Philadelphia doctor, and then shaking with laughter, "Oh, Mrs. Graves, if you could have seen him when those 3 eggs slipped into the smoke!" "I saw him not long after," said Dr. Harlow, "and he looked like a tombstone. I wondered then what awful trial had befallen him. Sarah, do you remember how you said afterwards that a special providence must have suggested broiled chicken and muffins for supper that evening?" "Oh my!" said our doctor. "Here is a dish of broiled chicken I forgot to serve. It isn't equal to Sarah's getting up on that particular evening, though." "Nothing ever will be," Mrs. Graves said, meekly, "unless you happen to get lost in a desert and have nothing to eat for 3 days." "Tom, what became of the shawl?" suddenly questioned Dr. Graves. "I have it, or rather my wife has. Keeps it in her bureau drawer, I think, or somewhere. Please to remember that I was wound up in it the first time she ever beheld me, on that never to be forgotten day when I went to shovel snow." "I'd like to know the fate of the comfortable," said Dr. Harlow. "What about that, Dick?" Our doctor laid down his knife and fork and burst into an absolute roar of laughter. "There is positively the funniest story about that was ever heard," he began. "Now, doctor," his wife said deprecatingly. "Now, Sarah," he answered eagerly, "do let me tell them. This is the very evening for all sorts of absurdities, and it is too rich to keep. You know, Tom, that comfortable used to lie—" Clang! sounded a bell, with one loud, sharp peal through the house. The next instant the story teller was summoned from the table. He came back in a very few moments. All trace of the merry Dick had departed. He was the grave, earnest-looking professional man. "I shall have to be excused," he said, speaking to all of us at once. "I am called to a very serious case. Dr. Benton and Dr. Harlow, I should be glad if you would both come down after supper. The office boy will show you the way. It is at Newton's, Sarah. I may not be back tonight. Good evening, all." Grave and dignified, he departed. And I never heard the story of the comfortable. End of Section 24. End of Dr. Deane's Way and Other Stories by Faye Huntington and Pansy.